Hi everyone, welcome to the GlobeDoc discussion of In My Blood It Runs. Thank you so much for joining us. My name's Yvonne Abraham. I'm a columnist at the Globe, and I'm so delighted to be here. We're going to chat for about 45 minutes, and in addition to my questions, we will try to get to as many of yours as possible. There's also a Q&A tool at the bottom of the screen, where if inspiration strikes you, you can pop a question in and we'll try to get to those too. And if you're not with us or you want to relive the magic later, we will be recording this discussion and we'll make it available to everybody who has registered. All right, so we're going to get started. And before we begin our discussion, we're going to do a land acknowledgement. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this, it's quite common in Australia and in New Zealand and also in Canada. It's an opportunity to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners and ongoing custodians of the land. Since we're in two countries today, I'm going to make a land acknowledgement for our location here in Massachusetts, and then I'll throw to William, who will make a land acknowledgement for Australia, where he is today. We acknowledge that the land we are meeting on today is the original homelands of the Mashpee Wampanoag, the Aquinnah Wampanoag, Nipmuc, Noumkeag, and Massachusetts tribal nations. We acknowledge the history of violence and forced removal from this territory, and we honour and respect the many diverse Indigenous peoples still connected to this land on which we gather. William?
Thank you, everyone, and thank you very much, Yvonne. My name is William Tilmouth. I'm a direct descendant of the Eastern Aranda people, closely related to the Central Aranda people of Central Australia, Alice Springs, a place called Mbarntawa. It's the traditional name of Alice Springs is Mbarntawa. And as you all know, that Australia is made up of approximately 250 different tribal groups. So I come from the centre, and I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of this country, and also welcome you to the Q&A that we're having now. So thank you.
Thanks so much. So let's get underway. I'll start by having Maya and Rachel introduce themselves, and then we'll get into it.
No worries.
Rachel, you want to go first?
Go ahead, Maya.
So hi everyone, my name is Maya. I'm the director of the film. Also, I just wanted to also start by acknowledging the land that I'm standing on today, which is the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation in Sydney, Australia. And I also wanted to acknowledge the Aranda people in Mbarntawa and Ngara people in Borroloola, which is where we've had the privilege to make this film over the last 5 years. It takes so much courage to tell your story publicly, and so I think it's really important to acknowledge those old people and also those on screen who you've just watched, hopefully, if you've just watched the film. So I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge Dwan Hoosen, Megan Hoosen, Carol Turner, James Mawson, Margaret Anderson, and also our partner organisations, Children's Ground, Aquila Healing Centre, our amazing producers, Sophie Hyde, Larissa Barrett, who are not with us today, and our advisors, including William, who you've just met, Mrs. Abbott Perula, Amelia Turner, and Felicity Hayes, who's a senior traditional owner of Alice Springs in Mbarntawa, where we've been filming. It takes a real collaboration and massive group of people to make a film like this, and so I just want to put that acknowledgement where it is due.
I'm not sure. Maya's the director of the film. Woman Jika or Wada, or in my language, Uvla Lotak, Rachel Naninaaq, Naninaaq, Edwardson, with Good evening to you guys in Boston. It's morning for us over here. My name is Rachel Renee Newtok Naninaaq Edwardson. I am from the top of Alaska. And just by way of starting, I also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people whose country I'm standing on right now and acknowledge that their sovereignty was never ceded. The Aranda people in Central Australia and the Garo people in Northern Australia who we've been fortunate enough to work with over these many years to bring you this story. And pay my respects to their continued strength and leadership in the spaces of storytelling and carrying on traditions and heritage and raising up beautiful young people. I'm a producer on the film, and we're really thankful to be with you today. So thank you for hosting us.
Lovely. All right. So Maya, let's start with you. Why did you want to make this film, and what were you hoping to achieve with it?
Thanks so much, Yvonne. So I think that the film kind of sits is along many years of relationships working with Aranda people in the desert in Alice Springs. And about 10 years ago, I had the privilege to be invited to work alongside people to make films about the empowering work that they're doing to educate their kids in language and culture and identity. And that was with the two organisations that I mentioned at the start, Akilira and Children's Ground, and they're Aranda-led organisations to support kids and ground them in their identity and culture. And I suppose just going out over those years, we made beautiful films, but I felt, there's this same story that continued to be made, which was about this hidden education system that was not valued, which was, these beautiful kids that might speak 1, 2, 3 Indigenous languages, who were confident out in their country, who were, just so vibrant. And then those same children would come back from the mainstream education system and say that they felt like failures. And that came to make sense because they're only measured by Western values and only taught in English. Now, it's actually a United Nations Declaration of Human Rights to have your education in your own language and through your own culture. And we don't afford that to children, to First Nations children in this country. MK, who is Duan's great-grandmother, who you saw in the film, she says, they're always telling us to make our children ready for school, but when are they going to make schools ready for our children? And I think that, it was very sad, and it feels like there was a story that was sort of, bubbling underneath there. So then I met Duan, and he's that beautiful, charismatic, poetic, cheeky kid that we've all spent the last hour and a half with. And he just has a beautiful way of articulating the world around him, and really wanted a film made about him. We were laughing the other day talking about how he's probably one of the only kids in Alice that, just does not hold that that shyness or embarrassment of being followed around with a camera. He just really wanted to be centerfold and to go on this journey. And so we sat with William and with Rachel early on in that time, and all of those elders who I mentioned at the beginning, advisors and those organisations, and thought about how we could make this film and if it was right to make this film. Obviously with any film, but particularly with children centerfold, it's really important to consider all of the, possible ethical questions that come up in sharing a story like this. My previous film as well, Gaby Baby, is about the voices of children being raised in same-sex families, which is my story. I've got 2 lesbian mums, and that story caused a national conversation in Australia where those children spoke truth to power and were significant in the push for marriage equality and adoption equality in this country. So I knew the power of children's voices, and I think, Duan just had that. He had that, beautiful ability to take an audience, I think, on a journey. Without going too deep long, but I think part of those conversations early on was, how do we make this film take into account the history of misappropriation of First Nation stories for a very long time in this country? And, with the guidance of Rachel and all of her work, working with her people in Alaska and all around the world, and leaning on that history of First Nations and artists of colour all around the world who have used collaborative and co-design models, putting subjects' agency first. We found a way to make a film that really acknowledged Dwan and his family's messaging and what they wanted for the film, and yeah, went on a big journey with to make this.
And so it wasn't just that this amazing family and this remarkable child were the subject of this film. They were really closely involved in the making of it from start to finish. Is that right?
Yeah, Rachel, do you want to, or William?
Do you want to start on that one, William?
The film itself is organically grown in the sense that Maya was filming things as they were happening, the feelings, the expressions, the anxieties and the frustration families were having in regards to the systems that were hemming them in, and they filmed this in a way that is so raw and so true. It's events as they were folding out in front of you, and at the end of the day, it's an unfriendly environment that this young fellow was growing up, and he could see the contrast between the haves and the have-nots in this town, and he could also see the grandparents and the mother could see the boundaries that he was about to breach, and if he had breached those boundaries, and he would ultimately have ended up in a detention center. And so they knew the boundaries were there, and they did everything they could in an effort to prevent that from happening. And the solution that they eventually came up with was one of the best solutions I've ever seen, and it's where the father stepped in and took the child to an environment where it's all nature and nurture, and none of these artificial boundaries that are there to protect the commercial interests of the town. So it really, it resonates with me, because I come from this town. I know what this town can be like.
I think, I'm sorry, Rachel, go ahead.
Sorry, I'll just add a few things on, connecting those issues there. That all those that part of the story that William raises was really the foundation for us understanding that, as you know, all of our team, I'm First Nations to Alaska, Larissa Brenta's First Nations to Australia, but to a different part of Australia. None of us were from the Aranda or Garwa communities. And we understanding that history of misappropriation and, that being lived experiences for those of us, actually all of us coming from other communities, we had lived experiences of having our stories taken away. We knew how important it was that we form a foundation under this film that the stories could grow out of. And that foundation had to be one which returned agency over to the people on the screen. And there's lots of different ways of doing that. And there's lots of people over filmmaking and media history that have pushed for that, but it's still not the mainstream way of making films. So we set up the advisory council under the direction of the family, who the family felt was going to give them confidence to make sure that the social political context and the issues and the way that this story was going to be told on screen was one that came out that had the nuance of their lived experience, and also stood in opposition to what we normally see on television. And this isn't different to the States. If you see Native people on television in the States, which you almost never ever do, but any other community, when you see them, they're always deficit, for the most part, it's 90% of the time, the deficit narratives. They're problems with the law, they're failing in school, they're, in this country, long histories of all kinds of terrible labels that are put on Aboriginal families and parents and children. And you never see the strength that sits in the community. You never see what, Maya was talking about. You never see these parents and grandparents holding these spaces and continuing 60,000-year-old educational pedagogies, health pedagogies, and surrounding their children with that kind of love and support. You always see how they're failing. So we knew that as a team of filmmakers who were in control of this project, the only way for us to get that nuanced story was actually to go in opposition to what you're taught at film school, which was to say, we're going to give you creative control. We're going to create a environment here where we're going to collaborate, really truly collaborate, and you're going to have agency over how this story is presented. And then in the background, we're going to address the biases we know we have as having been raised by systems that carry, you know, an inherent injustice. And therefore, past that systemic bias and racism and sexism and everything else onto us, we're going to actually intentionally address that in this context and raise our understanding and capacity so that when we sit with you, when we sit with the community and the family, we can actually hear what you're saying. We can actually have real conversations. And then we went all the way through the film. You know, most documentary film crews, you won't have story conversations with the, they call them subjects. You know, we didn't refer to our people as subjects, is even the way that we think about it. You know, they won't have story conversations, they won't have process conversations, they'll have access conversations. Can we come and film you doing this? As opposed to, what are the issues that you're facing? What is that story that's not being told? What is it you would like to tell to the rest of the world, and how do you want that done? And then bringing, you know, a meeting of skills and talents to that question. So that was really the kind of guiding questions and foundation that led how we made this film. And we found in the making of that, we also went heavily on the work of other people and the work of other First Nations artists and companies around the world who have been doing this and who have been doing films in a different way. But we found that gave us, and that gave the family a confidence to say, let's just cover the story and find out what the story is, and as we go along, we'll become, you know, we'll work out what that story looks like and how that sits in a way that goes out so that it is a nuanced and in-depth story following this young boy, but it is not in line with the deficit narratives that we see on TV. It's not going to do harm.
I think, you know, one of the most remarkable things about this film to me is just how incredibly confident he is in his first culture. You know, Duan is this, I mean, he is really poetic. He has such strength and certitude, and he's like a little prince in his first culture. And then to contrast that with the scene where he's looking at his report card on the bed and he says, oh, there must be something wrong with me, because of the massive deficits in the education system there. It's just gut-wrenching, and that that disconnect between his culture and the culture and language in which he's being taught in these conventional schools is so enraging. Maya, did you have to film for months and months to get those examples we saw in the film of teachers making massive cultural errors in the classroom?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think, yeah, first up, we definitely didn't actually film for very long at all in any of the schools. And some of the scenes that you see are, you know, some of the first moments that we screened. I think it's also worth saying that for those moments in the film, we spent many hours of deliberation deciding whether to include them or not. You know, we certainly weren't expecting to have Duan's teacher, you know, teach that history of Australia and the very saying that, you know, Captain Cook is this hero that came and claimed the land. But like with all of the hard decisions, we went back to all the families and advisors and said, how can we include this? And overall, the decision to include some of those moments was that this felt like not one individual one-off moment, but it is both historically and currently still status quo, or at least quite common, that these kinds of histories are still taught in this country. And it's also represented in the kind of way that we celebrate Australia Day and make Captain Cook a big hero in this country.
Right.
But yeah, I think also teaching is a really tough gig. I come from a family of teachers, and I think that the film can be quite uncomfortable for many teachers to watch. And I think hopefully by including those moments, we can shine a light on what needs to change at that systems level, and really not point a finger or demonize any individual teacher, because they are just representations of their own bias, but also the bias of the whole system that we all live under. And so how can we use this film as a tool to create opportunities for training and support at that university level and pre-service teacher level for teachers?
Has anything changed in the schools where you shot? I'm sorry, Rachel.
So I just wanted to also point out one other thing, and then maybe connect it to an American context as well. On my other hat, I've worked in education, in the intersection between media and storytelling and education and professional development for teachers and leadership for the last 15 years. And so those scenes that you see in the school are they are the common, they're the standard. That's what I learned at school, but it is also what we're still teaching in our schools, both today and in America. Where you are teaching any intersection, any First Nations history, it often contains a very limited version of that history, a deficit narrative, a narrative that the people were completely, wiped out in the United States. Lots of times it's Indians don't exist anymore, and that, or completely lacking. You also only get Native history or the Native side of the native side of that period of history up to a certain point, and then we just don't talk about it anymore, which reinforces the idea that they don't exist. So it's really commonplace that that's in the classroom, and most times, I think it's a perspective issue, and that's what Maya touched on. Part of the incredible power of being able to sit with a young boy and see things through his eyes is, I think it's the first time to mainstream audiences where we're seeing what is the effect of how we're teaching and what tools we're using to teach children who are coming from non-West, non-Anglo communities, where we know in our education system and in all of our systems, they're founded off of, Western language, Western culture, Western ethics and values. And there's not anything necessarily wrong with that by itself, but if that is the only thing that we're allowing in our systems, if that's the only thing that's driving how we set up our services, then by necessity, it marginalizes everybody else. And I think watching the effect of that on a small 10-year-old child is the power of it grabs all of our hearts, because all of us, no matter where you come from, know that there's something missing, know that effect making him feel like there's something wrong with himself because this system isn't reaching him is the problem. So that was part of the conversation about why we included those scenes. But again, like I said, they're pointing to a systemic issue. And they're not, most people who've watched the film have incredibly passionate responses and often go after those individual teachers. Both the one teacher in particular, the other Dreamtime teacher, she's worked in the territory for 20 years and has actively worked very hard to try to increase her competency. And in that scene, she's trying to do the best that she can by including that lesson in the children's education. So I think it's about us understanding what systemic bias looks like and what the impact of that systemic bias is on our youngest, most vulnerable children, and then turning that into action, turning it into power to do something about that.
And I'm just to answer your question quickly, and then I'd really love to throw to William, but one really great outcome that has happened is that Yprinya, one of the schools in the film, they've actually watched the film and then came and brought a whole lot of teachers and kids to our premiere in Sydney Film Festival, and they've now eradicated that model of instruction called direct instruction, where you see the film, where the teacher is clicking at the children in the classroom. And also across Australia, we've had over 3,000 schools watch the film and study it over the last couple of weeks. Actually, we offered the film for free for teachers across the country, and rolled out a number of resources and had an incredible reaction from teaching institutions at the highest level who have watched the film and had specific screenings for their staff and management. So small steps.
That's pretty fantastic. Small steps are good. William, I wanted to ask you about something. This film draws such strong parallels between the stolen generation and the way Aboriginal children are dealt with by this massive system today. You know, in place of the missions that remove children from their families, we see kind of a more anonymous apparatus at work. The juvenile justice system, the education system, the child welfare system. And I was wondering, William, if you would just talk to us a little bit about some of your experiences as a child, and tell me whether you see much has changed.
In terms of outcomes, nothing has changed. The outcomes are the same. You end up with your detention centres full of Aboriginal children. You end up with your jails full of Aboriginal people, and that's a really stark contrast in regards to Australia's shame. It should be something that we should be quite ashamed of. But that system is designed very much the same system of assimilation that I was subject to. I come from a family of 8. 5 of my siblings were of fair skin, and the last 3 were of dark skin. And welfare decided, and the government decided, that the dark ones will be sent north, and we went 1,500 kilometres north of Alice Springs to Darwin, and then from Darwin to an island 150 kilometres northeast of Darwin to a mission called Croker Island. It was a Methodist mission. The other siblings were sent south because of the fair skin. They were told that you have a better chance of assimilating and into society, and they were sent to Adelaide, which is once again about 1,500 k's south to Adelaide. And I was sent to Croker Island purely on an assimilations scheme that would take away my identity, my culture, my country, my family, my entire being as an Aboriginal person. And we were growing up, weren't allowed to speak any language. We had to literally learn English and be prepared to, you know, be assimilated, and that's what we were. It was nothing but an assimilation school. And in 1967, I was taken there. I was 10 years there, and we left in 1967. And I've never been back there since, but not because I didn't like the place. The place was a beautiful place, but you know, these poor cottage mothers had to deal with you know, 10 to 12 very distraught kids who would cry at night, and you never know why you're crying or what you felt. I mean, my 2 brothers would sit there crying uncontrollably, not realizing why we were crying or what we were crying for, but we've all had a shared grief. And many kids have gone through that. In fact, a lot of them haven't even survived to this day. You know, whether it's all the pressure and that early childhood adversity just stays with you for life. It never goes away, and people tell you to get over it, but that's easier said than done. And I took all that time to come back, find my way back, because I was lucky to hold on to my surname, and I could identify. People would say, "Oh, are you Alice Springs bloke?" And so I'd make my way back to Alice Springs, but many kids had their names changed. Many kids were fostered out. Many kids were adopted out. And ultimately their names were changed, and they never did find their way back to wherever they came from. And I got back, you know, after 18 years, and I met my father, who, you know, for the last 3 years of his life. And at that time I was too young and naive to ask the hard questions, and I wish I did, but there was a lot of things that he knew and a lot of people he knew that I didn't know, and we had nothing. There was no connection there apart from the fact that I knew that he was my biological father. There was no real welcoming home or anything like that. It's just I lobbed into Alice Springs in the middle of winter with Darwin attire on, mind you, just a t-shirt, jeans and thongs. And Alice Springs is very cold in the wintertime, but that's how it turned up here. And ultimately, you know, I became part of the system that Duane was being subject to. It was just a moment away from him entering that system, that very same system that I was on, and it's a conveyor belt that they put you on, and it's the ultimate outcome is that you end up through the penal system in as quick a move as you can, you know, blink, and yeah, and that was something that hasn't changed. Both systems lead to that. Both systems, you know, you got very high out-of-home care programs. Many kids are out of home care. Very few people ask Aboriginal people for what is their solution. You know, the system doesn't allow you to have agency in your life. I recall my auntie and my dad actually went to court to try and keep us, and the welfare said, no, we're going to have to take them, and they took us, and we had no contact with any of them until we eventually left the mission. And yeah, it was, yeah, you were let go at the age of 14, 15-year-old, and you literally had to find your own way through life. And that's how it was. And just, you know, allowing people, this is what this film's about, is allowing parents to have agency in their lives, allowing people to choose the solutions that they see fit. You could see that they love their children. You could see that they care for their children. You could see that they worried for Duane and where he was going and where he was heading. And they could see the dangers that the road he was taking. Not in a deliberate way he was taking, it was just him exploring the boundaries of his life and going out late at night and riding bikes that didn't belong to him. And, you know, there was a whole heap of that sort of stuff going on, but he was just a kid trying to have fun. And ultimately, waiting at the end of that fun would have been a system that would have consumed him, and he would have become just another statistic. And
it really seems to me that along with the culture being passed down through the generations, there's also a kind of trauma for being passed down as well, in the sense that Duane is really conscious of what happened to his elders, who were also taken away from their families. And, you know, I'm wondering if you feel at all optimistic, William, that cycle and that thread of trauma that runs through generations of First Peoples in Australia, whether that can change, whether it can end.
Well, Australia has a lot of problems in terms of education, justice issues, economic issues with Indigenous people here. And it's because the system doesn't change. The system that's imposed on us doesn't change. And it becomes a contest of space, and space to be Aboriginal, space to be who you want, and space to practice your own culture and to follow what your ancestors have given you. And it's that sort of, we want to tell our own story. We want to, you know, not stories that they want us to tell. Our stories need to be told, and we need to, as I say, we're not seeking our voice. We're not looking for our voice. We have a voice. We just need to use it. And that's the situation around the world today, is that people are starting to utilize their voice and to push against the status quo and to stand up against systems that are oppressive. And it's that voice that we need to find, and not find, but to use, because we do have it, and we need to use it a lot more than what we're doing. And through this film is through Dewan. That voice is very apparent in the sense that this young lad can stand up and he can show the world that you know, he's proud, but with the support of grandmother and his father's side, he's also now able to stay free from a system that would just consume him.
So I know a lot of our viewers will want to know, how is Dewan doing right now? Where is he? Is he in school? Is he developing his healing powers? Are they straighter?
He's with his family out at Spring Creek, but I mean, it's not yet over for him. He's got all the problems facing maturation in his development, and you know, he's going to come across friends and with the influence, and he's going to come across a lot of those stuff, but his foundation is pretty solid now. So he's coming from a foundation that is solid and not fragmented. My foundation was deliberately fragmented for me. It was one that they didn't want me to have, and ultimately at the end of the day, it's taken a lifetime to rebuild. Dewan has that now. He has evidence of that, and hopefully that would be the strong springboard that he can use to shore his own life up and to make the right decisions. Maya, you want to say something?
Yeah, I think that's really well put, because while he's doing really well, and we've been on a very big journey with this film already, as William said, he's still a young Aboriginal boy growing up in Australia, and as his grandmother says, in a racist country. And so that, you know, will present all sorts of challenges. But I think it is worth saying that we made a big effort on our film team to continue, obviously, that support, and these are relationships with the family that will go on. So we will walk alongside him and ensure that, you know, whatever opportunities arise, that we can try and support him to take them up. We took the whole family, that's, you know, grandmothers and parents and children and babies, like 8 people, over to Canada for our world premiere at GlobeDocs last year, which was pretty incredible. No one had been on a plane or had a passport, and that was huge. And then also Dewan and his family went to Geneva last September, where Dewan became the youngest person ever to address the Human Rights Council at the United Nations. And he called for us adults to stop cruelling Aboriginal kids in jail, in particular 10-year-old children, because in Australia we have a criminal age of responsibility that is 10 years old. That's 4 years younger than the international human rights standard. We think it's all right to lock up a 10-year-old in jail, which is Dewan's age in the film. And also he called for his school to be run by Aboriginal people, which is, I suppose, translated into how his grandmothers talk about it. They want First Nations-led education systems in this country, and also to have a life that is out on land with strong language and culture, which again is something that in Australia is hard to do, because there's a lot of services that don't support homelands, don't support education out on homelands where families are. So yeah, we're on a big journey with the family, and Dewan's had lots of traveling opportunities, and we'll just walk alongside him through his teenage years and see what happens. But yeah, during COVID, his family spent, you know, 5 weeks out on country, out on his beautiful homelands, as depicted in the end of the film, fishing and being very secluded, which I think he was having a pretty nice time. I saw some of the fish they pulled out of the water.
And then how has the wider community there reacted to the film? Is there a sense of pride, and do they feel seen?
I think I'm just going to mention one thing. I'm going to throw to Rachel or William, but it's been a big process, but we did take the film back and had a big premiere at Hidden Valley Town Camp, which is the opening, some of those opening scenes of the film. We had a big blow-up screen and filmed and screened it on Sunset. Carol, Dwan's grandmother, led all of the young women in a dance, which was very beautiful for Dwan and for the family. And families spent, you know, hours into the early hours writing their speeches, and everyone got dressed up. And along with Children's Ground, our partner organisation, and the local traditional owners who hosted the event, it was just very beautiful and a lot of pride, I think, in the air. And they hadn't had an event, let alone a screening there, for over 20 years. So, yeah, I think that, yeah, there's been a lot of pride, and for us, that's been one of the most important things as filmmakers, to see that those in the film and those who, that community, yeah, feel that sense of pride.
But sadly, I think that the status quo, the government policies, and that really don't see that in this film that it allows Aboriginal people to find a solution, and governments are still standing by what they believe in, which is just more of the same and a variation of yesteryear. And it's sad to see that it needs to resonate right up through to the powers that be, that we can find solutions, we can find answers, given us the chance and the support to do that. And I think that there needs to be a system reform in the way that we do things with Aboriginal people, as well as especially Aboriginal children. And Children's Ground is the organisation that I chair, is all about that, is a systems reform in early childhood education, ensuring that that foundation remains intact and is not destroyed and not deliberately smashed to bits because we want people to assimilate. We want people to be strong in their identity, in their culture, their language, and their country and family, as well as to be able to progress into a Western world. And that's something that governments are very reluctant to do, because it's an upstream model, it's a prevention model. And they don't see it as that, because they'll put a lot of money into the curative model, the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, but they will not put money into the upstream model of empowerment and environmental health and all those things. They're very reluctant to spend upstream and prevent all those babies coming down and for coming off the edge of that cliff, and the chronic diseases that we face, the situations that we face, it's all spent on the medical model at the bottom of the cliff. And yeah, it should be up preventing stuff. And that's what the film clearly shows, that if you can act in a prevention manner and achieve the results, you will prevent at least one young man from going down that road.
I think that's right. And lots of people can watch the film and they can feel, like maybe it's hopeless, or they don't know what to do, or where are the answers. But, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and First Nations people all over the world have those answers. They are just waiting for people to listen to them. And Dwan's own grandmothers run that organisation that William was talking about. They are leading their own first cultural education. And I believe that that is the same all around the world, and especially in the US. And we're hoping in Australia that we might have some policies that, remove funding from police, like what's happening in the US, and fund organisations that are preventative and upstream, and reinvest at the top end of the justice system in education.
And I think that just to place the story in the film, we started off talking about where this film came from. at the onset of this project, we were fortunate enough to have the support of an organization called Good Pitch, which meant that we could fund a social justice impact campaign alongside this film. And with everything we did, it always started in the community. It's always grounded in the community and by their own direction. And through that process, we are able to shine a light on not only the injustices and the immense nature of the weight of the impact of colonization that communities are under, but also on those actual solutions that exist right now. I think oftentimes we see the injustice and we see the problems. We see a child like Duan who's running away from school, who's in trouble with the law, who's struggling with all these things, and think, oh my gosh, how is this child going to survive? And we never look right next door to the fact that look at those parents, look at the grandparents, look at the family around him, look at the amount of advisors just helping with this tiny little project, and then magnify that out to the whole community. Look at the fact that the community actually has held itself together despite all of the weight of the impacts of colonization, which is all that trauma that you were talking about, the passing on of that multi-generational trauma is not, you know, often we think, oh my gosh, we shouldn't talk about this with children, but children are born into those situations. So they have to learn how to understand that. And this film and this project, because it has this impact campaign that's running alongside of it right now at release, as we're kind of birthing it into the world and sending it out there, the push from all of our supporters and all of our partner organizations, and then hopefully as we gain audience and we gain a broader community of support, the push is to start to open up our doors and open up our lenses to see that actually if we stand next to these communities, if we stand behind the communities and allow the agency and the solutions that they have on the ground right now to come to the front of the conversation, not somewhere in the back or not invalidated because they don't have this particular piece of paper or they haven't been doing that or they don't sit in government already. But if we put them at the front of the conversation, what we have is something that we can build on that is strength-based, that we know works because the community has been doing it for 60,000 years, because the community is automatically engaged because it's the solutions they're bringing to the table. And we know it has the power to heal the trauma that we see, to heal the pain that we see in that for both sides. Because I think, you know, when we look at injustice and we look at racism, the impact is on the other community, the impacts are on the First Nations or African American or any other communities. But the trauma is also on the non-marginalized communities, the white communities, right? What it does to us to be in those systems where we're creating that injustice. We have to heal that together. And part of healing that together is actually putting action to where our heart is. And that's what the families and the communities and those of us filmmakers behind this are hoping, that in the story of this beautiful young boy, where you see all of these pieces at play in the in-depth way that he has the ability to tell us, it stirs something in our heart, it stirs something in our spirit, and gets us to actually put action to our feelings, action to our words that aren't, as William says, aren't backing up the same tired solutions that have not worked for decades and decades, but are actually putting strength behind the voices of the people who have the solutions themselves that will work, that we know work. And this is, this is an international thing. In the States, obviously, with all the things that are going on in the States with Black Lives Matter. And then, underneath that, all of the rest of our communities have the same issues that we've been pushing and fighting for. That Black Lives Matter can be extended to First Nations Lives Matter, to Hispanic Americans, to queer, to disabilities. You've got the whole thing. And I think that comment you made at the beginning is true. We have an incredible opportunity right now to address the roots of these problems and to come together as a community and address those roots. It just takes a little bit of courage and a little bit of pushing ourselves into a little bit of an uncomfortable area, and being willing to start walking on something we know is a journey, not a destination, together. So fingers crossed. If you want to learn more about that, we'll post and send out all of our Take Action site, where you can find out more information about Children's Ground, which is a total systemic reform in education, health, economic development, Achille Healing Center, and then all of our lists of partner organizations who've come behind this project to give it that kind of push. And then, what in the States, it has a cinema release right now. We go to broadcast with PBS later in the year, and at that point we will have a whole lot of local resources that go alongside the Australian resources and community for people to learn more about.
Fantastic. All right, look, I think that might be a good spot to leave it. I can't thank you all enough for being part of this and for bringing Duan and the rest of his incredible community into our lives. Thank you so much. And I guess we just, we hope for a breakthrough, we hope for something to change. But in the meantime, you've all done an amazing thing. So thank you so very much. And thanks to everybody watching in their respective places. We really appreciate you joining us. So thanks so much.